everybody, and welcome to today's Talent Agenda series hosted by GCC. We're really excited to have you all here today on a topic that we're really passionate and interested about. I'm going to start today off. I'm the host for today's session. My name is Yael Rosen, and I'm the co-founder of Fervor, and then two tech businesses called My Feedback Guru and Pulse Motivation. Today's topic is a really interesting and one I'm very passionate about, especially because my business is female-founded, female-led, and 100% female-operated. And so it is a topic that is very close to heart, and I think very similarly for my special guests of panelists today. So to start off today's session, I'm just really going to set the scene and discuss what the topic is about, and thereafter I will be introducing all of our panelists to you. So if you were informed about the topic today, it is about a focus on female talent. And the question that we're posing today is, what is the importance and impact of women in senior positions and corporate African boardrooms? And it's a topic that we think is very relevant just because of some of the struggles that are taking place in Africa, and not actually just in Africa, but actually all over the world. So although African companies and African governments are now starting to actively encourage diversity, the reality that we're faced with, though, is that the appointments in African corporations are still being made by men and to men. And ultimately, the lack of women in senior positions is due to the result of companies not being intentional enough over the last few years with regards to recruitment or grooming and growing their internal talent to actually take up leadership roles, which ultimately leads to a lack of gender diversity in the boardroom, which we obviously believe is something very important that we're going to be chatting about today. So perhaps the best way to encourage intentional hiring and equity within the boardroom is to make evident the benefits of having women in senior positions. And I think as four ladies here today, we know what some of those benefits are, and that's something that we are going to want to talk to you about today in a bit more detail. So before we actually get started, I'd like to introduce each one of our panelists. I will share with you their names and what their titles are, and then I will open the floor for them to give us a little bit more context on who they are, their experience, and why they're passionate about today's topic. So first we have Angela Domingos. Angela is the Human Resource Director from Africell Angola. She comes with a wealth of experience and knowledge in the HR field, and so we would love to hear a little bit from her later on. We then have Carol, who's the Global Director of Talent Acquisition, D&I, and HR Business Partnering for MasterCard. And Carol, too, has a wealth of knowledge and experience within the human resources space, and she'll be sharing some of her insights with us. And lastly, we have Jennifer, and Jennifer is the HR Director for East Central and West Africa for Beiersdorf. So it's a really interesting and exciting panel. And before I allow them to dive into some of the questions that we're going to pose, I'd love them to each introduce themselves to us, tell us a little bit about their background, their knowledge and experience, and why this topic means something to them today. So I'm going to kick off and start with Angela. Angela, we'd love to hear a little bit more about you. Please share that with us.
Thank you very much, Yael and JCC, for the invite to make part of this webinar. I am Angela Domingos, HR Director of Africell Angola, and I've been working with HR for the last 18 years. Talking about talent, focus on female talent, it's very important to me because I've been working for the past, I would say, 12 years in the technology sector and engineering. And it's amazing the gap we can see when we think about professional, female and male. And I think that all the companies should be driving a real effort to break this gap by identifying, growing, and developing the female talent. Because if we look to Africa, if we look to the ratio between the population, we see that at least 50% of the population in Africa are female. And the numbers show that only 21% of this population, and when we are talking about professional in wage occupations, are female. So there is a very big gap that we need to break, and we only will be able to do it if we have a more collaborative and structured effort to improve these numbers.
Okay, great, Angela. Thank you so much. We're going to get to all the detail on some of the things that you're mentioning now later in the chat when we pose some of those questions. I then would love to hand over to Carol to introduce herself to us and share with us a little bit about her knowledge and experience in the field, just so that people have a context when she shares some insights with us. So Carol, over to you. Carol, are you there?
Yes, I am. Sorry, just too many, chats open on the screen, so trying to find the unmute button. Thank you so much. So really looking forward to our session today. So I'm currently leading talent acquisition, diversity and inclusion, and business partnering for the MasterCard Foundation. So this is a nonprofit organization. So a year and a half ago, I made an intentional move, out of corporate into the private sector and thoroughly enjoying it. D&I is something that's close to my heart and close to many others. And we've seen across the globe, more intentionality around increasing representation of women, in business. And this is just not at the top. It's really at all levels. You start at the bottom and you work your way up to the top. I'm really looking forward to discussing more on that.
Awesome, Carol. Thank you so much. I think it would be really interesting later on if we can talk about the role of females in senior positions in businesses like the one that you've just joined, because I think that's quite different to my own business and obviously to Jennifer and Angela. So that's maybe something we can chat about later on. And then finally, our third panelist for today is Jennifer. So Jennifer, we'd love to hear from you. Please share with us just some of your experience and background and why this topic means something to you.
Right. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So glad to be part of the panel today. So my name, Jennifer Padayachi. I'm the HR director for
Jennifer,
BIOSOF.
so sorry, but your sound is not coming through clearly. It's just slightly reduced in volume.
Now?
There we go.
Now?
That's great.
Perfect. All right. I just hit my speaker. So glad to be part of the panel. I'm the HR director for BIOSOF, Central East West Africa. I'm based in Kenya, Nairobi. So BIOSOF, for those who might not be aware, we are in the cosmetics industry. I think we're more famously known under the brand Nivea in Africa. So I've been with BIOSOF for 2.5 years, and prior to that, I've been mostly in the FMCG world, working for British American Tobacco for about 13 years, and also in property development here in Kenya. DNI, I think I'll bring it a little bit more personal to me in terms of I have a young daughter of 3 years old, and that topic is I'm very keen to see what is the change that I can bring into the corporate world, so that when my daughter comes into into this world, hopefully the landscape would have changed. So I think this is where my passion comes from on the topic.
Awesome. Really exciting. And I think, again, to your background and where you're currently working now, very interesting to understand the role of women in businesses such as yours, because it is a cosmetics business.
Correct.
And what does that really look like? So we'll get there.
Yeah.
So great, ladies. Thank you so much for taking the time to introduce yourselves. We're going to kick off discussing a little bit more about the topic. We invite the audience to ask any questions in the chat. Please feel free. We will screen the chat from time to time. And if there are key questions, we absolutely will get to them, either if it's in the moment when it's relevant, or we'll kind of address questions towards the end. So please feel free to share with us. And any thoughts or feedback on the panel and our discussion today would also be highly valued. So I think to kick off, I'm going to kind of pose a question, and I'm going to actually direct the question to Jennifer to really help us start this conversation today. And that question is, do you think gender is on the agenda for corporate Africa? And would you say it's something that is actively being pursued? And why is it or why is it not? So Jennifer, would love to get some of this insight for you, especially in relations to the cosmetic space, just so that we all get some really great insights that we might not be aware of.
Right. Thank you, Yael. So is it on the agenda? I think the short answer is yes. All right. So if you look at the major corporations, everybody has D&I as a topic, and I think over the last few years we've seen a huge traction in terms of bringing that agenda to the table, including having dedicated resources to deep dive into this agenda. Now, is it actively being pursued? I think it's a different story, right? So I think the conversations are happening. Everybody is, D&I is part of the strategy. But I would say, yes, it is on paper, but I believe some corporates or some industries are getting better traction in terms of making it become reality than others. Yeah, so I think that's how I see it right now on our continent.
Okay, great. I think what's really interesting in what you said is you said it's part of the conversation, but what's more important here is the action that's actually being taken to make the difference. And that's where we need to see real change. So, Angela, I see you smiling while Jennifer's kind of sharing her thoughts with us. Would love to hear from you what your thoughts are on this and what this means, particularly in your context and your environment at AfriCell.
I agree with Jennifer. Definitely, gender is on the agenda, but I think that the companies still have a long way to go before we are able to say that we're successfully improving the numbers when we look at across the globe. And mainly when we talk about Africa. Africa has 44 countries, and when preparing for this webinar, I was trying to get statistic information and trying to get some additional information on where we are as a continent. And when we think that there are 44 countries and basically 3 countries will appear when we talk about having female in the boardroom, for instance, these tell a lot about what we're doing and what we need still to do. Okay. So yes, this is something that is on the loop of the companies. I think that maybe it's lacking specific goals and strategy to achieve real improvement in terms of where we are and what we want to where we want to get.
Okay, great. Thank you, Angela. And Carol, I think we'd love to hear from you. I mean, when you introduced yourself, you spoke to us about your kind of shift in your career into quite a different type of organization. And it would be really interesting for us to understand, what kind of agenda is there for women in your kind of context?
Great, thank you so much for that. And I have a good news story. So, with the MasterCard Foundation, our vision is, we believe that everyone should have an opportunity to learn and prosper. And we are hoping to create 30 million jobs by 2030. Now, our focus is on youth. So that is those below 35, and 70% of those being women. So all our programming, all our investment is, with that focus. So 70% women, and then the balance being those that are disabled, refugees, or people with disabilities. Now, we're also looking to have the same representation internally. So in terms of our workforce, we're currently on 63% women, right? So again, we look right across the spectrum to make sure there is that representation. And then we embed diversity in all aspects of what we do. So in terms of our pipeline, in terms of, schools, etc., investing in the girl child, programs for women in leadership, even in the recruitment process, we make sure that our sourcing We make sure, there's that adequate representation and that we have diverse panel. And in the unfortunate event that women leave the organization, we really want to drill down and understand. And we're also then just looking at policies to support women.
Okay, amazing, Carol. Thanks so much for sharing. I think it's just really interesting to hear the type of impact that you're working on. I think is huge. The numbers that you mentioned and the impact that will have in Africa to a huge percentage of the population, which is women, I think will be hugely valuable. So it would be great to touch base in the future on that and see the progress that the MasterCard Foundation is making towards that, I think, as well. And I think, contrary to some of the insights given by Jennifer and Angela, you speaking about real action, where there's a plan in place to make real change and not just necessarily it being a conversation and something spoken about. So to hear about those plans being put in place to actually action and make the change for women, I think is really impactful. So great. So I'm then going to pose our next question, which is, what are your current views on the current representation of women in Africa's corporate boardrooms? And again, that's really to your context and maybe the environment that you're in, but also based on the country that you're in, if you have any insights on what's happening in that space. So I'm going to start with directing this question to Angela, for her to maybe share with us what things look like in her region within Africa and in the business that she's in.
Thank you, Yael. Here in Angola, it's amazing. We have currently an interesting number of female holding senior position in big companies like Coca-Cola, like ExxonMobil, and many others international companies we have here. So I think that there is a big improvement if we compare with, I would say, 5-10 years ago. Clearly, we can see it not only in the corporate sector, but even in government and the public sector. There have been put some efforts in improving the number of people we have holding senior positions. AfriCell, we have specific programs running to try also to follow up on this. And we are working specific strategy to, since the beginning, look into how we attract, how we identify talent, and how we onboard and develop these people while they are with the company, so that we can retain and we can grow these people for more senior positions. So I think that in a generic view, talking about Angola specifically, we are in a good track. There is still lots of work to be done, because even though there are several examples that we can appoint of people and female women holding senior positions, when we look to the numbers, there is still a big gap that we need to break.
Okay, great, Angela. Thank you so much. Jennifer, I would love to hear your thoughts on this topic and just your views on the current representation of women in Africa's boardrooms.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the short answer is, we still have a long way to go, right? So I think some countries, some corporates are a bit ahead of the curve. I think Angela reminded us that it starts with a representation of the population, right? So 50% of Africans are female. So in whichever industry you sit, in whichever country you sit, it's a very clear-cut a burning platform. So in Kenya, or let me say in sub-Saharan Africa, where I'm currently operating, and in the industry where I'm operating, in the cosmetics industry, we're serving majorly a female customer base, right? So for us, it is absolutely necessary to bring that customer's perspective into the boardroom, right? So we cannot develop a portfolio of products for women by a male board. Yeah, so I think it starts with that, and I think also looking at the wider societal purpose is that women play a key role in our economies, because they are a major driving force in the informal sector. what we find in our countries is that women also are the, I would say, the heads of their households. So they are the ones who take, make sure that the kids are educated, that the kids are, given the right platform. So it's only by making sure that we elevate their role into corporates that we will be able to sustain that role in the society, right? So that they are able to be given the resources to then build the future of Africa. So I think that for me is, from a general point of view, why we would, need to pursue that agenda further.
And Jennifer, just interestingly, in the context that you're in a cosmetics business, what does female representation look like in senior levels? How good is representation?
So at the Biased corporate level, which is, at the corporate level, we're currently sitting at 50%. Yeah, so we have 50%. And I'm very proud because, it's not in the most, I would say, typical roles where we find women. So currently we have our CFO is a lady. The person who is leading our legal function is a lady. HR, which is probably one of the most, typical one, is a lady. So so we're finding women coming into those atypical roles where we typically don't see ladies. So that's working quite well. Closer to home in Africa, we're not quite there, right? So we are working. We do have a roadmap to get us to at least a 50% representation. But it's taking, I think we'll talk about it later on during the webinar, but it does take a little bit of affirmative actions to help us get there, while being careful that, we're not compromising on capability versus, just driving the D&I agent. I think at the end of the day, none of us, I'm sure, even on this call, as a female, would like to feel that we were being put in a role just because we are, a female. So I think nobody wants to get to that point. Yeah, so that's where we are right now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think very interesting for people to be aware of, especially in the cosmetics space.
Yeah.
And Carol, what about you? Just on this particular topic, what are your current views on the current representation of women in Africa's corporate boardrooms?
Yeah, so I see a lot of momentum. I see a lot of results, tangible results. I suppose most of my recent lived experience has been in South Africa, right? So we know South Africa is sort of very clear in terms of, that agenda. And you see a lot of, younger women, very capable women, assuming leadership positions. So South Africa is really championing women, in my view. Recently moved to Kigali, and again, similar, see similar momentum across the different sectors as well. And if I also look at some of my other exposure on the continent, so I've seen gender awards, other institutions setting up gender awards, sub-regional gender awards in East Africa, in West Africa. And I really see women really coming fully into themselves and leaning into leadership. And I think we should soon be entering a space where we just refer to all as leaders, and we really just stop, amplifying or pulling, making women stand up to say female leaders. We are leaders first, right? And then all the other dimensions of diversity that people have shouldn't really be, how we're labeled and recognized.
Absolutely, and I guess that's the dream for where we can get to, where diversity and inclusion isn't even a necessary topic to discuss because it's just the way of life and the way in which we operate. But I think there have been leaps and strides, I think, in Africa and globally, but I think there's still a long way to go, which I guess is why we're having this chat today. So I think to that particular point, I'd love to know why is it important to you personally and generally to have women in senior positions in the boardrooms, and what does it really mean to you? And I'm going to really kick that off with directing that question to Jennifer first. When we were preparing for this topic, Jennifer kind of explained to us and shared with us why this is something that means so much to her, and I think very relevant for many of us that'll probably be in the call today. So Jennifer, over to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm very passionate. I think we all are. Yeah, yeah, right. So for me, I mean, I speak about it at the beginning. Is I have a young daughter, and when I reflect on my past 15 years, right, in the corporate world and the experience that I've had, I would really look forward to my daughter, seeing experiencing something else. So that's more from a general point of view. Being in the cosmetics industry kinds of elevates the topic as well, because we are on an everyday basis developing products for a female customer. So making sure that that female customer perspective, is taken into consideration. And if I can add to that, an African female customer for that matter, right? So for a global brand like Nivea, we've had invested largely over the last couple of years to understand what does the African female customer want, and to translate this need into a product that satisfy a specific need requires a true representation of female in the corporate world. But I think from a more from a corporate culture point of view, women have a role to play in setting the right culture in an organization. We are different. We bring a different perspective. We bring a different ways of doing things. In terms even of the behaviors that we expect from leaders, I think when you have ladies in the boardroom, the conversations or the tone of the conversations change. Yeah. I've personally, experienced sitting in a boardroom by myself with male colleagues, from simple things, from the language to the tone and how we debates about certain things. That changes when you have a true balance on gender representation. So for me, that would be why it's so important, and the benefits that it can bring to any corporate.
Okay, awesome. And Jennifer, interestingly, on the kind of contrary to that, I'm a mom of two little boys. And the
Yes.
topic of gender diversity is so interesting to someone like me, because I need to be the person spearheading it, that's something that's very normal and accepted to them. So it's
Yes.
really interesting to hear it from a girl mom's perspective, where it's definitely important for your daughter. But I think for
Yeah.
me, going to work every day and trying my best in my own capacity to ensure that diversity and inclusion is front of mind, it's really important that my sons see that, and that becomes their way of life and their way of understanding. And not that I need to have conversations with them when they're in their teens about why women are important in the world, but that's so they know that from the kind of the earliest part of their lives. So really interesting.
Correct.
Angela, I would love to hear from you and why this is so personally important to you.
Well, I think that Jennifer has shared very important insights on this. Diverse boardroom lead to more inclusiveness decisions making processes. And again, when looking to the numbers, in Africa specifically, 50%, at least 50% of the population are female. So our customers, our employees, all around, we need to remember that female are part of the conversation. And for that, we need to understand that they need to be part of the decision-making process. And this only can be done if we understand that bringing people and look into corporate strategy to bring diversity, it's important. For myself, personally, I've been working, as I mentioned it, and specifically about recruitment and talent acquisition for the last, I would say, 17 years. And again, if we don't have, and Carol have mentioned it, several actions and real actions that help us to build a culture of diversity on the way how we process everything about people management, we will be making decisions that will be biased and will keep on driving this gap between female and male on professional environment. So for me, it's very much about making sure that we have representation that will allow a more balanced decision of the companies for all the market, for the employees, for the customers, for all of us.
Okay. Thank you so much, Angela. Thanks for sharing that with us. And Carol, any insights from you? Why is this, something that is personally important to you, that women hold senior positions in the boardrooms? Carol? Carol, can you hear us? Carol, I think there's maybe a slight struggle in your connection. So I'm going to pause there, and as soon as you're able to kind of jump back on, we can direct another question to you. We're not able to hear you very clearly, and you were frozen there for a sec. So I am going to move forward. Carol, sorry, are you there now? No. Okay. So Carol's just, I think, having some connection challenges. And maybe we'll come back to that question in terms of why it's important for her. But I'd love to really move on to another question. When we were preparing for the webinar and discussing the topics and some of the ideas and suggestions and questions we were going to pose, Angela spoke to us about something that she was quite passionate, and that's really why do you think it is still so difficult today to achieve gender equality in corporate Africa, and especially at senior levels? So Angela, over to you if you want to take that question for us.
Thank you, Yahel. I think that there are several factors, but pointing to the key ones, I think that in some cases it's like lack of a specific goals and strategy to achieve gender equality. And from one side, and then from other side, we have the structural social challenges. So when we think about culture, when we think about education,
Looks
which
like
is related.
Angela, sorry, we lost you there for a second. If you don't mind just rewinding in your thoughts by 10 seconds.
Okay, so while I was talking about, so I spoke about the lack of strategy and specific goals when we talk about gender equity from one side, and from from other side, it's related to the structural social challenges. So things like culture, education, and in several points, Carol had mentioned something which is very important, is that we need to understand that we will not achieve from one day to another one plenty of female talent available for C-section positions. Okay, we need to target from the bottom, starting from the beginning, look into universities, to technical schools, and try to have a strategy of identifying and developing since the beginning young talent that can then grow up in the different ladder up to the more senior roles.
Angela, thank you so much. You brought something up which is very interesting, is how early on, I guess, do you kind of start this process to ensure that you're able to get women into senior positions in a boardroom? And I guess if you look at some of the statistics, specifically in South Africa, where we have a relatively big percentage of our female population falling pregnant under the age of 18, and women not even being able to finish high school, and preventing them from even being able to do that, it prevents them from going on to tertiary education and to being able to get really good employment opportunities going forward. And so it really, the question kind of begs, like, how early on should we be kind of spearheading this. And I think in our country specifically, that's something that's actually very important, because we need to empower women to be able to be educated and to complete their school education, move on to tertiary education. And not that not being a mom is not something important, it absolutely is, but being an educated mom is something that's really important too. So I think that's a very interesting piece to talk about as well. Carol, we did lose you there, but we definitely don't want to lose out on some of your insights. I think, the recent question that we posed, which Angela just helped us, is really about, why do you think that it's still so difficult to achieve the gender equality? But before I even pose that to you, I'd really like to take one step back and just ask you why it is personally important to you to have women in senior positions in the boardroom. And then from there, maybe to progress into the next question, which really is about, why do we think it's still so difficult in Africa to do that?
Thank you so much. And sorry about the connection. Actually, I think my answer to the earlier one about why it's so important to me could also partially answer the next question. I think a lot of it is cultural, right? In terms of how we are socialized. So, personally growing up, we were raised in a society where, the men lead, the boy child leads, the boy child knows best, the boy child gets preference in everything, and that the girl child is lesser than. And it wasn't out of any malicious intent. It's just, again, just how we were all socialized. So then that is projected and perpetuated throughout life, the various life stages. And so people are socialized that way, and that's the ecosystem within which we operate. So when it comes into the workplace, naturally the same thing would kick in. So why it's important, I think, for us, for women to be, at the table, is it just also just enriches the conversations. And we're not saying having women at the table means we undermine or exclude men. No, it's just now creating a more inclusive environment. And it's very important that women show up authentically and have their voice, and not feel pressured to show up in a certain way or not have courage. Um, so yeah, then just extending back to the second question. So we need to see more men championing women. And men are also fathers to women. They're also sisters to women. They've been raised by women. So I think it's just really enhancing the consciousness and connecting the dots for them, really. And I think, that will probably be, the game changer there. And in terms of, as you're saying, going back, how far do we go back? I think there's so many, it really goes back to birth, right? Because we're not just looking at the girl child, we're looking at the system within which she is raised, right? And then the choices she has and the access that she has that will set her up for success. And it's really, really all in the formative years. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Really interestingly, you brought up something that we chatted about when we were preparing for the webinar, and that's really about the fact that we're on this panel today talking about diversity, inclusion, and why women are needed, the kind of impact that they have, but we're sitting in a panel of only women with perceptions framed from our own reference point, with no men sitting alongside us to champion this. So I guess with kind of jumping a little bit into that topic, would love you to share with me, if we had to pose these questions to your colleagues, your family members, close friends who happen to be male, what do you think their responses would be? And I guess, why do we not have champions alongside us today that are men speaking about this topic for us? So it's one thing for us to say we need women in a boardroom and we bring diversity and different ways to think, and we're able to provide a holistic view, but really, what would the men alongside us say to that? So Angela, I'm going to bump that question over to you first while you're sitting there nodding, just to hear what you think the men in your world, whether personal or at work, would say if we were posing these questions to them.
Thank you, Yahel. I think that this is a very interesting question. Probably looking to my professional work environment, currently, I would say that it would be eventually mixed feedback. I've been experienced all along my career, several people that, and I'm talking about males specifically, that do understand the importance of diversity and inclusion, and that are able to understand that really need to work on promoting, developing, and sponsoring female so that they can come to a level where they really can contribute. And when I'm talking about contribution, I'm talking about impactful contribution for not only for the company but also for the society. One thing that, in talking about the thing you mentioned regarding South Africa and female several times getting pregnant very early and not even being able to finish the school. This is something that we see a lot in several countries, and I think that this is very much also related to the fact that we don't see many role models, female, representing, okay? And this lack of visibility uh, keep on growing on the people the idea that the men are the ones who are in the leadership and they are the only ones who are capable. And starting with this type of thinking since very early in our lives, in certain extent, limit us to dreaming to go above and beyond where we are currently. Okay, so it's important that we break this and that we can work on improving and giving more visibility. And I have experienced, luckily, uh, male who were able to understand this and to try to promote and to sponsor female. And when looking to my personal relations, to friends, to family, and happily, and also this is something which is cultural, we still have lots of people that naturally think that women are in a second paper, and for that reason they, even if they have the tools, they wouldn't be able to go further. So there is still lots of work that have to be done on this, though there are already people with different view, but there's still a lot of work that we have on this.
Okay, great. Thank you, Angela. Thanks so much. So we have about 15 minutes left of our webinar. I just want to encourage the audience who is listening to us today to put any questions into the chat, and we'll get to those in the next kind of 5 to 10 minutes. But I would like to start kind of wrapping up the webinar with what I think is probably one of the most important questions. And that's really with our panelists sharing with us what are some of the strategies that you believe think can help to create more gender balance in senior positions within corporate Africa? And examples from your organization would be so interesting for us to hear, just so that we understand the different thinking, strategies, approaches that we can all maybe learn from. So Carol, I'm going to pose that question to you first and just ask you to maybe share with us what are some of the strategies that are happening within the MasterCard Foundation specifically.
Thank you for that question. So, I think just to allude to what I mentioned earlier is that we've got to take a look at the whole pipeline, the entry point. And there's more than one entry point, right? So you look at how you're nurturing the young talent, the girl child, making her capable, making her believe that she can go into spaces that she's not considered before. And a lot of those spaces would be, STEM, as we know it to be, as an example. So give her that access, give her that opportunity, build her confidence, expand her knowledge, and support her as she enters, the workplace. Then in the workplace, just again, really watching the numbers and creating the necessary experiences, right? And then watching where they might drop off. So in some cases, some women may need to exit the workforce, but being open that it's okay to take a gap and then you can come back. So I'm just tapping in all my sort of collective experience and not exclusively to the foundation. So those are just some of the practices to say it's okay for women to take gaps and let women come back to the workplace, and giving them the flexibility when they come to the workplace, that you don't have to be there 100%. You still have your family responsibilities. So how do we give that encouragement? And something else that we're doing, and I'm also seeing that in other organizations, is extending paternity leave. So, right, allowing men, giving them that responsibility and support to also, participate in, other responsibilities and raising family within the workplace. But I also say, much as all that may happen, as women, we also need to demonstrate that we are capable and that we are adding value, right? And that we continue to lift others, as Angela was talking about the role modeling, right? Each one lift one, and just really continue to champion each other. But I don't want to be too restricted to just gender. I'm just wanting to be more inclusive right across, to just say, let's make it a more inclusive conversation and approach and a strategy. So I will pause there. Thanks.
Thanks, Carol. I think the topic of paternity leave is a very interesting one. And it's something that I often share with clients that we work with. We have a lot of businesses in South Africa who've been giving significantly longer paternity leave than is legislated, and none of the men use it. Which is so fascinating, because being at work is a lot easier than being at home with your children. And I think that just that as an example explains the challenges of what it's like to be a woman at work, where you do have your family responsibilities and your work responsibilities, and just how difficult that actually can be. But I think, Carol, you raise a really interesting point, that it's not about necessarily working the same hours, but it's about having your contribution in an organization, even if they look slightly different and come at different terms. And I think that that's a very meaningful and powerful point to have raised with us today. So thanks so much for sharing that. Jennifer, would love to hear from you just what some of the strategies are that Beiersdorf's been considering and been implementing over time.
Right. So yeah, I think the obvious ones which most organizations are going with is, some affirmative actions, even at the point of recruitment, right? So we've made some very conscious decisions lately that where we have seen, for example, that we have a gap in terms of female representation in our country manager roles, general manager roles. So whenever we've had the opportunity to bring on board new employees, we've said, you know what, let's just go with a 100% long list of female candidates, right? So it sounds a little bit extreme at the beginning. I've been one of those with even when we talk about sales roles, for example, field roles, where I said, really, are we going to find the right caliber of resources? And we did, right? So it just says that when you look hard enough, you do find, very capable female candidates for these roles. The other one that we've done lately is creating spaces for very senior roles, which are, we call them borderless. Yeah. So because global mobility of female candidates is also a challenge, right? Because of your family responsibilities, would your family be able to just up and go and follow you in any other country if you're being appointed in a role? But what Beiersdorf has done is now, there are certain global regional roles that can be based out of everywhere. Yeah. So I can sit in Kenya and hold a regional role, for Africa, Middle East, for example. So so these are some of the actions where before, and I think unfortunately or unfortunately, the pandemic has shown us that it can work, right? So where before you need to sit in that regional office in that specific country because this is where everybody else is sitting. Now we're finding that, you know what, you can sit anywhere else as long as the time zones and language and stuff like that works out, that can still happen. So these are kind of the two, I would say, top of mind initiative that we've adopted in Biostov.
Great, Jennifer. Thank you so much. I think you actually addressed a comment that someone had written in the chat. Someone called Jumoke, I hope I've pronounced that right, says, we talk about D&I, but it starts from recruitment. We cannot have good female representation in the boardroom when the ration of male to female is 70-30 at recruitment. And so I think prioritizing from a recruitment point of view allows us to get that talent into the organization and start to equate the numbers. And I think that's definitely a very progressive step in order to try to create as much balance as possible. And I think to your point, it might be harder, it might take a little bit more time, but ultimately if it is prioritized, it is something that absolutely can be done because there is the talent out there to actually put females into those type of positions. So lastly, over to Angela, just to maybe share with us some of the strategies that you have been working on and implementing within AfriCell.
From AfriCell side, we are working similarly like Carol has mentioned it and Jennifer. We look to the pipeline as a key piece of driving diversity. So we are starting early, working with fresh graduate programs, try to identify as soon as possible young female talent that we can attract and that we can develop through the hierarchy structure. We partner with different external entities to have in place mentoring and coaching programs that help to have our female employees working with more experienced people covering different sectors, but mainly the ones they are working on or they are interested on, so that they have a kind of network support that help them to work in a more structured way to break the difficulties and the challenges that they have on the work. And we are currently working with specific ratios, numbers in terms of gender equality goals. Not only in the generic view of the headcount, but also looking to senior roles and to specific pool of positions. Again, and as very well said by Jennifer, the idea is not to bring people only because they are female, but try to have a direct effort to identify people that we know that are capable and that they can grow and add value to the company, so that we can show and showcase not only internally but also externally that there is plenty of female talent outside that we can bring in and that they can help us to build the company that we want to be.
Thank you, Angela. Thanks so much. So I think very interesting strategies shared from you three ladies. We don't have too much time left, and I just want to get to some kind of statements or questions that were posed in the chat. And the first is a question that was stated by Payoka. Again, hope I have been able to pronounce that accurately. But Payoka said, women in the forefront push men into leadership positions and complain about being excluded. And I guess it is an interesting thing to consider. And I guess the question is, do women in senior positions become part of what's known as like the boys' club? So Jennifer, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say yes and no, right? Depending on the context. Yeah, you do find where unfortunately some corporates are only joining this bandwagon late, that the ladies are joining, a boys' club, because you find yourself in minority positions. But I think the bigger issue is when your male colleagues, are not informed enough about the topic, where they continue to drive the business conversations, they or even behave like there are no ladies in the room, if I can put it as bluntly like that, right? So what I've seen, for example, with Basdorf, that works quite well, is just to drive that awareness amongst not only ladies. I think, Yael, we were talking about it earlier, we are 4 ladies in the room, but having our male colleagues to be part of this conversation also drives that level of awareness to say, when we do have a diverse boardroom, how do you make sure that everybody feels included? And I think Carol mentioned that earlier. Let's drive inclusion as opposed to just representation. So yes, unfortunately, it is the case. And then, balancing as well our personal obligations drives that feeling as well, because whenever we're done with a board meeting, if your male colleagues are going out for a drink and the female board member has to rush home, because she has personal obligations, it drives again that mentality of of a boys club. But I think for me, for this to shift, we need to create more awareness and educate our male colleagues more, for us to be able to manage a culture which is more inclusive.
Great, Jennifer. Thank you so much. And I think lastly, we just have 2 more minutes left. Yeah, not too much time, but Eunice in the chat wrote, what is your top tip for positioning for board appointments? And I'd love to direct this to Angela, just to maybe share with us what some of her thoughts are from there.
Well, I think that it's very much, there are 2 important things. First of all, we need to be ready, to prepare ourselves to outstand. And this requires, at some extent, courage, because as mentioned several times during our conversation, we don't see many role models. We see lots of stereotypes and bias information all around the professional conversation, and usually the tendency is to think that leadership is for male. Okay, so we need to be ready to show that we can really add value. Okay, and have the courage to break this idea that it's only male sitting in the main room. And we need to drive this type of conversation in HR mainly has a big play to role. Try as much as possible to influence and to bring this type of conversation to the table in our companies, to build the culture not only in the senior management but also with all the full structure of the company, that it is possible. It's possible when we need to have a structure, we need to have goal, we have to have a clear path and plan to build ourselves to the place where we want to be.
Thank you, Angela. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. Again, just so insightful. And just, yeah, thanks for sharing your views. So I think we sadly have to wrap up because we've already just gone past the 11 a.m. mark. I just want to thank each of the panelists, Angela, Carol, and Jennifer, just for your time. Really just appreciate you taking the time today to share your thoughts and your experiences in the different countries that you're in Africa and the different roles and positions that you're in. We really appreciate your time and your insights. I found them so valuable, and just it's been lovely to engage with you in this hour on a topic that I think means quite a lot to all of us. And here's to hoping that the conversations continue, not just here amongst us females, but out there, and that action plans are put in place more than just conversations. So thank you all so much. Just to wrap up, would also just like to thank GCC just for putting together these Talent Agenda series. They are hosted quite regularly, and we recommend that you keep an eye on when the next one will be. They're always really insightful and have a great host of panels attending, just with some really interesting insights from Africa. So thank you, ladies, all so much for your time. And thanks to our listeners for listening today. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your days to listen to us and to share some of your thoughts and questions and comments in the chat with us. So thank you all.